So, let's set the scene. On May 28th, 2020, we saw the birth of NHS Test and Trace here in England. It was a massive government-funded service rolled out under the UK Health Security Agency. The goal? To curb the spread of COVID-19 and eventually help ease those blanket lockdowns we were all struggling through. And honestly, no small feat, right?
Right, but what really stands out is how ambitious the whole thing was. From the beginning, this wasn't just about containing the virus. They envisioned a system that could handle future pandemic responses. That's a tall order for an agency created practically overnight. You have to wonder about the pressure on everyone involved.
Absolutely. And leading that charge was Dido Harding. Now, she was a Conservative peer and a businesswoman, not exactly someone you'd expect to oversee public health initiatives like this. Later, though, it transitioned under Jenny Harries in April 2021, and her approach, was more grounded, coming from her time as Deputy Chief Medical Officer. But even then, the programme didn't exactly shed its controversies.
Well, the leadership shift is a significant point. Harding faced mounting criticism over inefficiencies, the reliance on consultants, and, of course, the staggering costs. When Jenny Harries took over, the public needed reassurance that changes were being made to improve effectiveness. But public perception by that stage was, let's say, less than favourable.
Speaking of costs, this is where it gets jaw-dropping. The initial budget, $15 billion, has eventually ballooned to a whopping $37 billion over 2 years. $37 billion. To put that in perspective, that's more than the annual budget for some entire government departments.
It is staggering. And I suppose the question that lingers in everyone's mind is, was it worth it? I mean, the aim was straightforward: reduce infection rates, bolster testing capacity, and prepare us for future waves. But with such colossal spending, you really have to scrutinise the outcomes.
Yeah, it feels almost surreal, doesn't it? Trying to balance that level of spending against public expectation, all while the pandemic itself kept shifting the goalposts. And it clearly wasn't just a matter of throwing money at the problem. There were fundamental systemic flaws that needed to be addressed.
Exactly. Leadership aside, budgets of this size are designed to create sweeping, efficient systems. The NHS Test and Trace programme quickly became a litmus test, not just for pandemic management, but for how the government handles crises on this scale.
But hey, this is just the beginning of the story. The details of how it all unfolded and the hurdles they faced, especially with staffing and those collaborations, give us even more insight into what made NHS Test and Trace so, polarising, really.
So we've talked about the colossal spending and those systemic challenges, but let's dig into the workforce side of things. 25,000 contact tracers were mobilised to build an intricate web to track and isolate cases. It sounded promising, but even from the outset, cracks in the system became apparent.
Right. It was meant to streamline everything, identifying positives, tracking contacts, getting people to isolate. But the collaboration with local authorities, that was less than smooth. Many councils complained the national system wasn't making the most of local expertise. And to make it work, a lot of the heavy lifting was outsourced to private contractors like Serco and Citel.
Yeah, and that outsourcing sparked some backlash. I mean, when you think about it, this state-of-the-art system was primarily in the hands of private companies, not fully integrated with local health protection teams. It's easy to see why people felt it wasn't cohesive. And, get this, those contact tracers? There were accounts of them twiddling their thumbs for hours on end, with no cases to follow up. Efficiency, huh?
Not exactly confidence-inspiring, no. But let's switch gears for a moment and talk about the testing sites. More than 700 were set up spanning England, with mobile units to reach harder-to-access areas. Sounds impressive, but the reality? Many people were struggling with distance. The 2.4 miles average, they touted, wasn't the experience for everyone. Some found themselves driving hours just to get a test.
Yes. And when you're already worried about COVID symptoms, being told to travel far and wide just adds to the stress. Plus, let's talk logistics. These sites were often run by companies like Deloitte or Boots. And while businesses were stepping in to help, there was criticism about the reliance on private firms over, public health infrastructure.
Absolutely, and then there's the NHS COVID-19 app. Oh, that app? It was supposed to be the linchpin, integrating seamlessly with contact tracing. But its rollout? Plagued by delays. They originally aimed for mid-May 2020, but technical issues kept pushing it back. It eventually launched in September, miles behind the manual tracing efforts.
Gosh, and when it did finally arrive, it relied on the Apple-Google exposure notification framework. A smart choice in the end, but it really highlighted how much scrambling was going on behind the scenes. Like earlier, they were developing an entirely different system, only to scrap it. Can you imagine what that must have cost in time and resources?
A lot, definitely. But even with the app up and running, there was still hesitation from people. Some were concerned about data privacy, others about its effectiveness. And honestly, you can't blame them after all the earlier hiccups. The app was just one piece of a very creaky puzzle.
Creaky, but still essential, wouldn't you say? The app, testing sites, and massive team of tracers were meant to work together like clockwork. But with so many moving parts struggling to align, the operation often felt more like a juggling act. And, spoiler alert, that juggling got even trickier as isolation guidelines evolved and public compliance became a whole new challenge.
And speaking of shifting challenges, let's rewind to those isolation guidelines everyone had to juggle. Initially set at a strict 14-day period, they began to change over time. First down to 10 days, then to 7, and even as low as 5 in certain cases. It often felt like the rules were a moving target.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It wasn't arbitrary. These changes were supported by new data as we learned more about the virus and how it spread. But at the same time, it also reflected public fatigue, People were struggling to comply, and that human factor had to be considered.
Exactly. But it wasn't just the guidelines creating waves. Let's talk outsourcing. So much of the program, testing, contact tracing, even software systems, was handed to private contractors. Companies like Serco and Deloitte were at the forefront and, well, not everyone was thrilled about that.
And rightly so. There were recurring questions about efficiency, costs and transparency. I mean, think about it. For a program that cost $37 billion, you'd expect a well-oiled machine. Instead, it often felt disjointed, like the parts never quite clicked together.
Disjointed is the perfect word. And it's that very disjointedness that eroded trust. Look, I know outsourcing has its place, but shouldn't something as critical as public health rely more on, public institutions?
It's a valid point. As the programme wound down in February 2022, under the government's Living with COVID strategy, it left behind more questions than answers. What worked? What didn't? And how do we rebuild public faith for when, not if, the next health crisis hits?
Yeah, and those lessons are vital. Whether it's a clearer focus on local partnerships, better integration between public and private sectors, or simply setting realistic expectations, it all has to be learned from. Honestly, there's no other way forward.
Agreed. NHS Test and Trace was ambitious, even visionary in some ways, but it became a case study in what happens when ambition outpaces execution. The world will be watching how these lessons translate into future public health policies.
And on that note, I think we've covered quite the journey today. From ambitious beginnings to a less than perfect end, NHS Test and Trace offered plenty to reflect on. Until next time, folks, stay informed and stay safe.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us and take care.